some more are coming, but I think we can
Yeah,
start.
yeah.
All right. Okay. We would like to welcome you all. Actually, I don't think that there is a need to introduce Sarah Mercer. Everyone knows Sarah Mercer well, but formally, let me introduce Sarah Mercer for today's talk. I think someone's microphone is.
Sorry, Jürgen, I'm sorry. Can you mute your microphones, please? Okay, thank you. Yes.
Yeah, thank you. All right. Sarah Mercer is professor of foreign language teaching at the University of Graz, Austria, where she is the head of ELT methodology. Her research interests include all aspects of the psychology surrounding the foreign language learning experience. She is the author, co-author, and co-editor of several books in this area. She has been principal investigator on various funded research projects and serves in numerous editorial boards. She is currently vice president of the International Association for the Psychology of Language Learning. In 2018, she was awarded the Robert Gardner Award for Excellence in Second Language Research by the International Association of Language and Social Psychology. I think, I'm sure you all admire her as I do. We admire you immensely. Thank you very much for your guiding publications. Actually, you are enlightening our way. Thank you for accepting our invitation for this talk, Sarah. Now, the screen is yours, and I think maybe you would like to tell a few words before we accept the questions. What do you think?
I'm happy to. I'm happy to whatever you want me to do. It's lovely to be here, and thank you for inviting me. After an introduction like that, I always have a little bit of a case of imposter syndrome. I feel like looking over my shoulder, who's here? Who are they talking about? But it's lovely to be here. What would you like me to do as an introduction? What would you like me to?
I don't know if you want to do that, or if you wish, we can immediately start with the questions.
Yeah,
we have a couple of questions in our hand. The audience, some of the audience wrote the questions in advance.
Super.
And of course, we are waiting for the participants to ask their questions in the chat box.
Great, that sounds good.
All right. Okay. So then let's start with the questions that we received already.
Okie dokie.
Yeah. All right. So Masood is here. Let's start with Masood's question at first. So Masood says, my question concerns with the issue of teacher well-being beyond the context of teaching in the classroom, as many professional teachers need to take on different roles outside the classroom, including a parent, researcher, author, mentor, supervisor, etc. They may come up with some challenges in life which may affect the quality of their teaching. Imagine a professor who is a busy parent trying to finalize a paper or a chapter book while also worrying about deadlines for a presentation or some other publications. Shouldn't we take a holistic approach to teacher psychology and consider the multifaceted nature of positive psychology in teaching as a whole in individuals? Can't parent or researcher well-being account for some parts of teacher well-being, for instance? Thank you. It's a long question.
It's a great question. Well, to be fair, Matthew, you just write the paper. I'm done. Actually, it's a great question, and it's really important. And one of the things you asked me about, Julida, earlier was talking about the development of positive psychology and the things that I have noted and the things that I feel have changed. And what Masood has sort of touched on that I think is hugely important is, I'll frame it in the context of teacher well-being, because that's the thing that I've been researching, and that's what you've asked specifically about. But it also relates to some of my concerns about where positive psychology has come from and where it's going. And I apologize to Julida and her doctoral students, because you heard me have a little rant about this a couple of weeks ago. So I apologize, I'm going to repeat myself a little bit for you guys. I agree very strongly with what Masood says, is that when we're a teacher, when we go into the classroom, we don't leave the rest of our identities and our other parts of ourselves behind. We're one person, we take all that with us. So especially with something like well-being, which is so strongly influenced by various aspects of our lives, you cannot just separate that into your professional life and your personal life. There's no such split. You are one person and all these aspects of your life come together. So I 100% agree with taking a more holistic perspective. There's a fabulous researcher, an educational researcher called Christopher Day, and he's done work and he talks, and I love this, he talks about these blurry boundaries between the personal and professional lives of teachers, that possibly more so than in other jobs, we tend not to have those strict delineations between your private life and your personal life. And certainly with what's been going on with COVID, in spatial terms, in temporal terms, it all tends to blur a little bit into each other. And so we can't, it would be naive to just talk about what's happening in the classroom. I think you can. I think there are occasions where you might want to place that focus in your research. But if you really want to understand well-being of a person, I do think you need to take the big picture. And that what's really important about that is means that we cannot be prescriptive about what people should be doing in terms of their well-being, because it's very individual. It's very, the other word for it is subjective well-being. It's very subjective. It's very personal. So the example that Masood gave was, if you're a parent with small children and you have no childcare, particularly for example, during COVID, or you're a single person with no dependents, nobody to care for, you've got different demands on your time. And you've got different motivations and different commitments. So I think one of the things that has concerned me about some of the literature that exists, for example, on work-life balance, is it's very prescriptive. And it assumes a certain type of person and assumes a certain situation. Well, you know what, life just isn't that straightforward. Let me have a look. There are 92 people in the room. There are 92 different lifestyles and sets of needs and sets of motivations. So people need that space to be able to decide what, the amount of time somebody might want to spend on their work, and they're perfectly happy doing that, is not necessarily the same as somebody else. We can't judge everybody by the same measure. And so well-being is highly individual. It has to be holistic, and it has to account for the subjective needs and wants of a person. So, there's a lot of criticism of people who work long hours and dedicate a lot of time to their work. If they get a lot of meaning for that and that suits them, we're not here to judge people about their lifestyle. But if people are devoting a unnatural amount of hours to their work and they're not happy and they're not getting meaning and purpose from it, and they're becoming one-dimensional, it makes them vulnerable. So it makes you vulnerable that if something does happen to your work or your job, you've got nothing else to fall back on. You've got no other aspects of your life. So I don't think we can be prescriptive in what we do, but we can be aware of things that affect everybody. Now, I can talk on my own for hours on end. I don't even need questions. The other thing that Masood raised that I'm going to talk a little bit about is this holistic view, which I think is quite important, is also about having a look at context. So it's not just about understanding the person as a whole and the other aspects and roles of their lives, but I think it's also about understanding their social, cultural environment, the relationships they have in their life. For example, in terms of education, we talk about the status of a language that they're teaching in the country, the status of the teaching profession. It would be naive to even think you can talk about well-being without talking about systemic and structural conditions. So I also feel very strongly that while well-being is something that we can investigate as a subjective experience and feeling, it's important to understand how that is in part dictated by social cultural context. And this has been a problem for well-being research in that any interventions that place an emphasis on self-care run the risk of taking away responsibility for well-being from systemic structural interventions. And we mustn't make the mistake of placing all the responsibility for well-being on individual teachers. And so that institutions, governments, policymakers can step back and say, oh, well, teachers just need to engage in more self-care. They need to look after themselves better. That's not the point. Well-being emerges from that interaction of structural and systemic factors, and also then your individual psychological reserves and resources that you draw on in that context. And it's the interaction of both that leads to your sense of well-being. So I think there is a little bit of a danger, and that relates to my understanding of positive psychology, that if we get too caught up in just the individual and the individual mental space, we run the risk of losing sight of how that person is, so you know, how that person's experience is also socially and culturally defined.
Thank you very much, Sarah.
Thank you, Masood. It's a great question, and you can see I could talk for hours about it. So thank you for a good question.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think Masood is happy with the response. Okay, so let's go on with the second question. We have a question from İrem Çomoğlu from Turkey. İrem says, since the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic process, a lot of teachers have been complaining about increased parental interference, which leads to increased teacher stress and increased blurring for teachers between work and private life. I know that you have been interested in teacher well-being in this sense. What would you recommend teachers and parents in these difficult remote teaching times so that parental interference does not constitute another stress for teachers?
Yes, I think this was interesting because in some of the research we did on teacher well-being way before the pandemic, the relationship with parents was one of the key stressors. So it was one of the key stressors that they mentioned before the pandemic. I don't know whether this is perhaps naive on my part, but I think they're just, we've all got the same interest in that we want the kids to benefit and we want the best for the kids in the learning situation. What we have to remember is that the online situation and the teaching that's going on at the moment online now is not normal online teaching. It's online teaching in partial emergency mode in the middle of a global pandemic. So everybody's stress levels are through the roof. It's not, you know, we're not talking about normal levels of stress here for people. People are under enormous strains, and their ability to regulate their emotions and deal with things is diminished. Now, I think in terms of parental involvement, there's what's his name? The guy called Chris Martin's just done a PhD about the relationship of parental involvement on motivation. And I think he's just published 2 papers on that are worth having a look at. I think there's a lot of evidence that if we can build up a positive relationship with parents and see them as partners in this process, and build up a dialogue of respect and trust. And that takes time. It doesn't happen from a quick fix solution. If we can build up that relationship and accept that we're both there and build up a sense of trust, that the parents trust the teachers and the teachers trust the parents, it's also about understanding mutual senses of responsibility, domains of control, responsibility. All of that has become blurred. So parents witness what goes on in the classroom because they're usually in the room with the students who are online. And because teachers don't have that face-to-face interaction to check on learners, they're depending also on parents to take action and responsibility at home to keep the learners on track. And that's also not necessarily been the case. So there's been a shifting of roles and responsibilities and a blurring. And I think people are finding their feet. I think they're understandably stressed. Parents are stressed as much as teachers because roles and expectations have changed. The frame of reference of how to deal with this has changed. And this is all taking place against an enormously stressful backdrop. So like I say, these relationships with parents are massively influential for learners and how they engage with school and their attitudes towards learning. We know from beforehand that relationships with parents were a main source of stress for teachers. This has all just been exacerbated by the situation at the moment. And it's hoped that if it can't be left up to individual teachers, but if there can be more space for dialogue, and if all relationships are improved through communication, and if there can be channels for communication between teachers and parents with some ground rules about respective interaction, trust, and how one communicates that, then there's a higher chance that both people will feel happy and more satisfied with how things are being dealt with. But I think parents need to give teachers some slack. This is not normal. It's extremely difficult. And every teacher I know has gone through an incredible difficult period of transition to online teaching. And teachers also need to understand that parents are trying to juggle 500 responsibilities at the same time very often, and are also faced with responsibilities in relation to their children's learning that they didn't have before. And they also feeling overfaced with that situation. I'm not sure if that really was a satisfactory answer for your colleague, but it's that's just how I see it as a maybe a naive outsider.
Yeah. But you are very right. I mean, this is a very difficult, these are actually very difficult conditions, and the situation is very confusing for all of us. So, I mean, both the teachers and the parents are right, actually. So they would like to do the best.
Yeah, everyone's trying to do their best in difficult circumstances. And so, you know, get a little bit of give and take on both sides would help that process.
That's right.
And, you know, a big part of well-being is also learning to say, I'm doing my best, and that's enough. And for most teachers, I think if we can learn that at the moment, say, I'm doing the best I can, and that's just going to have to be enough for the moment, that's perfectly okay. We can all let go of perfectionism at the best of times, but certainly now.
Thank you. We have another question, Sarah, regarding the situation due to COVID-19. Nesil Demir is asking this question. She is also here. Nesil says, how can we deal with the connection between teachers' emotions and students' emotions during pandemic in online classes? What kind of tips can you recommend us regarding positive psychology in language classrooms?
Holy moly. Well, this has been interesting. So one of the things that all the teachers in the different studies that we've been involved in have commented on, and Jean-Marc's here, so he should speak about the study that he did on learner emotions. We'll make him speak in a minute. But one of the things that's been interesting is that all of the teachers have commented on the fact that their priorities have shifted, that they've become aware of how important those relationships are with learners, and that not being able to connect in the classroom in the same way, that actually reaching teaching goals and reaching curriculum objectives has kind of taken a second stage to the social emotional side of things, where you check on learners' relationships, you build up that connection. I don't know, probably many people in this room have done these show and tell, where they go and they bring something and they show and they talk about it. And we have a little bit of time at the beginning of a session where we talk about how we're doing. I think almost automatically, and it's really kind of pleasing, is that in this sort of circumstance, most teachers have recognized that it's the social emotional basis of learning that is key. And it's key at the best of times, in my view. It's the foundation of good teaching anyway, but particularly maybe under the conditions that we are at the moment, teachers themselves have become aware of just how important that is, and they've made space to engage with learners as individuals, to try to talk, to keep an eye on how things are going, to ask them how they're doing, have those emotional check-ins. And so all the things that we do to build relationships with learners, to help them feel connected, to make sure, you know, it's that famous quote, everybody wants to be seen and heard. And particularly in the online space, you know, that the risk of getting lost and not being seen and not being heard is huge. And so these small actions that teachers do in asking how they're doing, commenting on them, you know, somebody sees their dog walk across the screen, or somebody sees their, you know, commenting on those things, those little forms of, they're called micro conversations, those little conversations, those little forms of connections, using people's names, asking how they're doing, giving them space to talk about personal things. That's more important than ever before, so that people have that sense of connection and that they feel that they're cared for, that they're not invisible to their teacher and their classmates. So I think that's hugely important at the moment, to make space. And to be honest, I think most teachers are doing that intuitively. I think they, in the data that we've been looking at, they sense that intuitively. I don't know if Jean-Marc is, so there you go. I was going to say if Jean-Marc wants to comment, because he's just done a study on learner emotions. So
yeah, right.
That's right. Yeah, that's right, Jean-Marc.
Yeah.
I just posted a quick comment.
Yeah.
I totally agree with what Sarah says. I think the silver lining of the pandemic will be, in fact, that teachers and even headmasters will have realized that teachers do much more than just transferring skills and information. They really have to make sure that their students are happy, engaged, and it matters, because not only will the students be happy, but they will perform better if they are happy.
Of course. And I think this is my real hope, is that that is one of the sustainable things that carries on from here. But I'm not always just going to open a really big can of worms and about testing systems and education systems, but I'll perhaps not open that in the context of where we are. But it would be, I think it's important that people maintain that afterwards, that we understand that attending to things like social emotional learning in the classroom and well-being, they're not additional add-ons, they're actually the foundation of what makes education work. And as John Mark says, if a learner feels seen and heard, if they feel a sense of belonging in the class, if they feel that they are cared for, pedagogically cared for, if they feel comfortable in the class, if there's a sense of trust, if they have got psychological safety in the group, they're going to learn more, they're going to be more engaged, they're going to be more successful. So these are actually kind of like the foundations of good practice. They're not additional extras to teaching the language, they're what we put in place so that we can teach the language. And so I realize that probably our whole culture and discipline has come at this the other way around, that they focused on the teaching of the skill of language. But I come at this a different way. I think you have to start first by getting those foundations in place, those social emotional foundations, and then you can work on how you're going to do the logistics of teaching the language and the didactics of language teaching. So I think that's also partly to do with the history of our field and the genesis of our field, why we've had that focus very strongly on the didactics and how we teach language. But actually, I think and maybe this experience in the pandemic has made clear that we need to go back to the foundations first and understand the psychological basis of teaching and learning experiences. And then we build on that in terms of the didactics.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. We have another question also about learner well-being from Algeria. I may mispronounce the name, sorry for that. I think it is Shahrazad Mahoubi. I'm interested in learner well-being. It is somehow difficult to find practical situations of implementing positive psychology in the EFL classroom, especially with the pandemic. There are few occasions to see learners. Face-to-face classes are very limited. Teachers struggle to teach EFL and feel huge responsibility of creating a stress-free environment. So what should be the solution?
I think it's a good question. So not wishing to just this, but there's a paper on using PERMA to teach student well-being that's free on the Oxford expert panel papers. So I can't remember the link, but if you just Google student well-being Oxford expert papers, and it's a short paper, and if you go to the bottom, it's right at the bottom of the screen, there's a free paper there that you can download, and it's got a little bit of an explanation of what student well-being is in the ELT classroom and how we can conceptualize it. And then it's literally got a whole set of activities that you can do, and most of them can be adapted to the classroom. And the model is based around PERMA, but perhaps some of the things that we've just spoken to, trying to build up positive emotions, creating that safe space. If we take the PERMA model, positive emotions, so how we can build positive emotions, ask learners about themselves, get them to talk about positive things, use positive news stories, think about the topics we're addressing. Can we put a positive spin on it? Think of the materials that we're using. Is there a way we can use more positive material? Particularly at the moment, I don't want to read any depressing stories. I don't want to read anything that's depressing or got a negative ending or cynical. I'm just not in the mood for that at the moment. And if I'm not in the mood for that, I suspect learners might feel the same way. There's a lot of, it's quite a emotionally charged time. So looking at things we can put more positive emotions into it. Also making sure that we don't forget to focus on learner strengths. What are they doing well? Where can we give praise that is constructive and focused? So not vague generic praise, but focused and constructive, so that they have a sense of growth and positivity also about what they're doing in their learning. PERMA, where was I? Engagement. So finding ways, so I still love, for me, self-determination theory is probably one of the best models because it works for motivation and well-being. So there are 3 pillars in self-determination theory. The first one is developing a sense of confidence. The second one is about a sense of autonomy, and the third one is a sense of belonging in the group. So doing group activities where they do things, where they do things together as a class, where we put them in breakout rooms in groups, that they create something together, getting them to work on tasks together. Many language teachers, for example, are familiar with jigsaw activities. They're hugely important to use also in the online space to create that sense of collaboration and working as a group. So thinking of ways that you can build those relationships in the classroom. Sense of confidence, anything to do with growth mindset. Also this sense of helping learners see progress. So creating kind of progress charts, or where they can do portfolios and see what they've achieved. So one of the things that makes me rabidly angry is this notion that learners haven't learned anything during this time. What nonsense, they've learned all kinds of things. And they've made huge progress in all kinds of different ways, and making that visible not only to the learners themselves, but maybe to other stakeholders and parents is not a bad thing. So finding ways to make learning progress visible also boosts sense of confidence and your sense of achievement. We've got relationships, how we build relationships with the learners, having those micro conversations, making sure we do this in the language classroom anyway, but making sure that we've really got those opportunities to find out about each other, give them space to talk and be themselves and have that personal interaction. Taking meaning from what they're doing, let them have space to bring in things that are personally important to them, get them to teach each other about things. I mean, the show and tell activities that have been so popular during online have got a lot of psychological rationale behind them. Getting people to share things about their personal life, teach others about things, it's hugely important. And again, the sense of accomplishment comes from this sense of gain. And then why not talk about well-being explicitly? Why not talk about exercise and nature and sleep patterns and use of technology and having time away from the screen, green time instead of screen time, as they say, talk about that explicitly, make that also a topic that we address. So I think there's huge potential to have that in the classroom. It's just looking at maybe what you're already doing and thinking, where could I put a little bit more of a positive psychology spin on this? Where could I put maybe just a little bit more of an emphasis on it to bring it out? It doesn't mean throwing all your teaching out the window and starting afresh. It means looking at what you're already doing and just thinking a bit more consciously about how you can maybe tweak that to put a more positive psychology perspective in. I hope that answered your question.
Okay, I think you did so. And we have another question related with COVID-19 situation again, from Milat Fahul. Due to the extent psychological barriers that COVID has caused, how can we ensure our assessment is valid and reliable, as misinterpretation of learners' performance might have critical consequences? And Milat continues and says, don't you think this might be a source of stress learning?
Yeah, I'm not an expert on testing, so I'm not going to talk about testing. That's not really in my field of expertise. So I'm not going to talk about testing and testing frameworks. But I would probably just go back to the beginning of all of these things about creating a relationship of trust. That if you make assessment procedures transparent, there doesn't have to be mystery about it. If you make it transparent, and if you open those pathways of communication, and you make yourself and your learners open for dialogue, you are likely to build more of a sense of trust. And you can talk about why, because I don't know any teacher who wants to give a student a bad grade. Every teacher I know wants to give a student a good grade where possible, but you have responsibilities to everybody. And a sense of fairness means you can't give everybody a grade A. It's not fair. As much as it would make our life easier, that's not how it works. And so it's also about looking that you have clear assessment scales, transparent procedures, and that you can communicate all that to the learners and also then to the parents, so that they see where grades have come from and why you've done that. And that also feedback on testing is not seen as criticism. It's seen as constructive help, that it's also packaged in a way where you're saying this feedback that I'm giving you is to help you in the future, and it's packaged in terms of constructive advice. Okay, so this didn't work very well this time. This is what I would advise you to do next time. This is something that you might want to think about. This is a strategy that you could use. This is a way you could approach that. So I suspect that's probably not a satisfactory answer, but that would be how I would go about it. And that's just me as a teacher, I guess.
We have another question from Ahmet Güneri. Actually, Ahmet is, I think, asking about your own feelings and concerns about after COVID situation. Ahmet says, ideally, we all think about the would-be bad effects of COVID-19 and the negative influences on teachers, students, and teaching, and so on. But how about the other way around? It has been more than 1 year that we are teaching online. The breakout of COVID was a shock for us as practicing teachers. However, we should look at it the other way around now as well. I feel that teachers and students are going to experience a reverse COVID shock after pandemic. Do you share my concerns and feelings?
It's a cool question. And yes, Ahmed, I think it's a great question. And yes, I would agree with you very strongly. So we did in a paper that it feels like it's been under review for all eternity, but it can't have been under review for that long. So it must be ready sooner or later. We went through all the data that we got from teachers, and we also have been doing interviews with teachers all the way through this process. And one of the ways that we described this was like a cultural transition when you go and stay abroad. That when we made that shift, everything was new, there was a sort of adrenaline surge, and then we coped, and then we adjusted, and then we settled. And then there was a real sort of dip where everybody was like, oh, what, really, more of this? It's nothing, you know, and then we settled to it, and we got used to it, and we adjusted it, and, you know, it's not perfect, but we are going to definitely have reverse culture shock. There's no question. I mean, certainly for me, I've spent a year and a half, I think, in academic years, and, you know, 3 semesters now of teaching online. And so to go back to the classroom is definitely going to be an adjustment. There's no question at all. And we've all changed. As individuals and as teachers, everything has changed. So there is definitely going to be a period of adjustment. And for a lot of people in this room who are also doing PhDs or research, what an exciting time that's going to be. So there's definitely going to be some interesting research, because that is a period of adjustment. So, and I think it's hard to predict, but one of the things that it comes out of, so there's a lot of people suffered all sorts of trauma, and it has been an undeniably difficult time. But there is a lot of research, and seeing as, you know, the context of today's positive psychology, there's a lot of research on post-traumatic growth. So how people can grow as a result in a positive way of having experienced trauma. And of course, there are all kinds of conditions that need to be in place for that to happen, and it's not automatic. But there is a great potential for people to grow, to have gained resilience, to have gained human capital in terms of skills and teaching repertoire, to also have shifted perspective. You know, maybe it's just me, but I don't sweat the small stuff quite so much now. I'm just like, oh, what, you know, in the big picture of things, you know, it doesn't really matter. I mean, I'm healthy, I'm alive, my family's okay, you know, that's all good. And so there is a great potential for growth. And typically post-traumatic growth tends to take place sometime after the end of the trauma. And I don't think we're quite, it depends where in the world people are, and certainly where we are in Europe, we feel like we're getting to the end, but we haven't finished with that trauma yet, certainly by a long stretch of the imagination. But this is a period potentially now for growth and for resilience and for positive experiences. But there is also a threat that people will feel unnerved, uncertain. They'll start to doubt their abilities to teach in the context of all the experiences we had going online. But somehow we had the excuse of that being an emergency situation. So we were quite forgiving of ourselves and everybody else, and our students were quite forgiving. Going back to the classroom, there's an expectation that we know how that works. We've done that before, we can do that. And there is a little bit of that there that should give us confidence, but the situation and we have changed, and the learners have changed, and our expectations have changed, and there will be a period of adjustment. I don't think there's any doubt about that. It's when any frame of reference changes, your self-concept changes, your sense of identity, everything changes. And so there will be a period of change when we go back into the classroom. But from the positive psychology perspective, it has the potential for growth. I hope that answered your question, your cool question.
Ahmet is here, maybe.
Ahmet, did that do the job?
Yeah, I don't know if you can hear me or not.
Yeah, I can. Nice, and it's nice to see you too.
Actually, I was trying to write as a thank you answer to my question, but you gave me the microphone, so I can just verbalize my thought. I understand from your thoughts that I'm not alone, because I really experienced that concerns and worries about my teaching. And like you said, we forgot about teaching the marker, the whiteboard, you know, and walking in the classroom and checking on the students, so on and so forth. And it seems to be, it will be really a shock for me, and it will take time to, you know, just adapt to the old system, old the way of teaching. So yeah, and which means I'm not alone, because as you said, from the students to teachers and lecturers and teachers of teachers like you, all of us, we are sitting down at home on our table, but then we have to wake up and go to the classroom. So on.
Yeah, it will be. It's exactly like we did in this study about culture shock. This is the reverse culture shock. This is the reverse culture shock when we go back into the classroom and we think that it's familiar, but of course we've changed. And so it is familiar, and certain things will be nice to have again and will be familiar and things we'll enjoy, but there will be a period of adjustment. I don't think there's any doubt about that.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. It seems that we all share the similar concerns about pandemic, after pandemic situation, as I understand from the comments in the chat box. So thank you for the comments. We have a question from Viaya Srivastava. The question is, how do you address anxiety among students about not doing enough? They feel we are not doing enough through online classes as compared to face-to-face classes, and they are disadvantaged. So how do you address anxiety among students about not doing enough?
It's a great question, and I have to admit that I do get a bit ranty and rabid about this because it makes me really cross. And the media is to blame as well for this. The media, well, I don't know about other countries, but certainly in Austria, the media and online, some of the stupid, ridiculous comments about, you know, where the kids are behind, they're missing out. And maybe it's the system that needs to change, not the kids. Maybe it's the system that's wrong. Maybe it's the system that needs to adjust. The kids have learned all kinds of things. They've developed resilience, they've developed digital skills, they have been learning content. My God, why have the teachers been killing themselves this last year and a half? Because they have been teaching and they have been learning stuff. So I think it's about frames of reference need to change. See, I was going to go on a rant then, because I just think it's, I think we're asking, I think that's the great question. I think the system is asking the wrong question. I think the media are asking the wrong question, and they're putting the onus on measuring things. It's like Ahmed just said, they're measuring things against the old system. The system has changed, and we should change, and the systems should change. And so we don't need the same markers of achievement that we had before. We have different markers of achievement for this period of time. So, you know, the system is wrong, not the kids, and certainly not the teachers. On the more practical level, before I disrupt every educational system in the world, on the more practical level, I suspect kids need things like portfolios and can-do statements. They may sound cliched, but they are a way of making visible things that they can do. So helping learners to really say, okay, what can we do? What could we not do at the beginning of this year? And what can we do now? Let's make a list of all the things that we couldn't do and that we can do now. Let's look at the portfolio. Let's get a piece of work that we wrote or that we did at the beginning of the year. Let's have a look at that and compare that to now. How much better is it than what we did at the beginning of the year? So really explicitly make visible for learners the progress they've done and the things that they can do. And it's also about when we give feedback. So of course, there's a strong tendency in education, and I include myself in this, that we tend to focus on what's wrong and needs to be improved. But we can really look at strengths-based pedagogy, you know, again, in the context of positive psychology here. We can look at strengths-based pedagogy and look at how can we help learners to become aware of what they're good at. what their strengths are. How can we give feedback that is praise, that is constructive? So students are not stupid. If you say, oh yeah, that was really good, and then you start to savage everything that was wrong about it, they know that you didn't mean it. But if you say, I really like the way that you did your paragraphing here, I like the use of topic sentences, you had a very coherent storyline. I think we need to work a little bit on tenses though. I think some of the tenses here were, so if you give very clear, very constructive, very precise, positive feedback, the learner can see it's not real, it's real, you're not making this up, you're not just saying something to pacify them, but there is actually something where you say, this is something that you're doing well and that you can build on and you can do more of. And also other strengths that learners have. So most of the learners that I know, and myself included, have a whole range of digital competencies that I didn't have a year ago. And, I'm a pro at Zoom now, you can't Zoom freak me out anymore. And learners are the same. There's a whole set of digital competencies that they have developed during this year. And we've spent the last 10 years talking about how we must do more to foster learners' digital competencies. Well, good God, in the last year, they've made gains that they haven't made, they've leapfrogged 5 years into the future. So it's a great question, and I think a lot of teachers and a lot of learners are struggling with that, and I blame media and politicians for this very disruptive and very unhelpful discourse about this. She says, having a little rant and bang her fist on the table.
I think Shahrazad has a comment related with that. Teachers will build another sense of identity after the pandemic of who they are. I think we will all build different identities after this pandemic situation.
Well, teacher identities are dynamic and fluid. They're always in development. We're always changing how we see ourselves. And this, not wishing to get in complex dynamic systems here, but this is a massive perturbation to the system. And some people may go back to how they felt before, but a lot of people will have had their identities disrupted in a way that the change will lead to something different.
Hi, everybody. Oh, that's okay. Oh, sorry, I wanted just to check my microphone.
It's working, don't worry. Okay.
Okay, really very glad to see many friends from different parts of the world.
Thank you.
Nice to have you here.
Thank you. Milad has a question, Sarah.
Yeah.
In what ways can teachers elevate departmental administrative policies on sticking to the rules, which were routine during the pre-pandemic era, to reduce affectivity?
I'm really sorry. Is the question written somewhere that I can read it? Because I'm not sure I got it. I just.
It is actually, let me check. This is all before the comments made. You can't see the question?
I'm just looking back. Hold on. I can see Viaya's question.
This is from Milad Fahul. Yes, before Jean-Marc's comment, that's right.
Hello, everybody. I can ask the question right now.
I'm sorry, I'm really sorry. I'm just acting stupid.
First, I gotta say hello to everybody and thanks for holding this very, very insightful session. Well, the point is that before the pandemic, there were rules, regulations, there was language policies, administrative policies. But when the pandemic hit us, actually everything changed. But the rules are still the previous rules. So in terms of actually assessment, meeting the goals and things like this, how and what is the responsibility on the part of the teacher to alleviate this problem? How can teachers make a connection between the pre-pandemic rules, the administrative policies, language learners, stressful condition to make it a successful, actually fruitful learning condition? And that was my point, actually.
Okay, thank you, Milad. That fundamentally, that's what teachers do. That's the definition of a teacher, is to mediate between those systemic conditions and what happens in the classroom with their learners. So that's fundamentally, that's the definition of a teacher's role. And given the fact that people here are from all over the globe, I couldn't give a constructive answer in terms of detailed what you can do in specific situations. That wouldn't be realistic. But teachers' jobs fundamentally are to mediate between the curriculum, the resources available, the regulations of an institution, the social cultural conditions, and the subject they want to teach, and the relationship with the learners. That's what teaching is. And so we can't free ourselves of those constraints. We have to work within them to the best of our ability. And this takes me back to the notion of teacher agency, which I think is hugely important and vastly under-researched. So teacher agency refers to your willingness and ableness to make decisions and choices to craft your teaching in a way that empowers you and your learners. And it's related to, of course, related to teacher well-being. Teachers who are high in well-being usually have a strong sense of efficacy and agency and feel that they can make a difference. So we can't free ourselves of the expectations on us and the context that we work in, but we can. It's the idea of job crafting. You can craft and you can do the most you can within the constraints that you've got. Now, the sort of next level from that is, when teachers are burned out and exhausted, they haven't got capacity to do anything else. And that's why teacher well-being is sort of fundamental for me to a lot of these discussion points. If a teacher's got strong, healthy well-being, they may feel that they have a greater capacity to come together with others to make and advocate for change. So all of us can engage in advocacy work if there's something that we're unhappy with and we feel that should change. But when teachers are burned out, they're just in survival mode. They haven't got the capacity in practical terms or mentally and emotionally to deal with other issues. And the most powerful advocates for educational change should be teachers. But a lot of the problems that we have in systems that restrict teacher agency and weaken their well-being leave them unable to either rebel, if we're going to put it dramatically, or to advocate for change, because they're just in survival mode. And that's why, there's a lot of things that would need to change. I think if you're an academic, you have a responsibility to take on some advocacy work. I think you have to advocate for change. You have to use your voice to make people aware, and policies and institutions through publications, but all through discourse. And teachers can be the best agents for change. Teachers are the most effective change makers, and it can start in the classroom, but it's never going to start when teachers are just in survival mode. And that's why I think empowering teachers positively and attending to their well-being will give them the capacity to be change makers. I'm trying to keep the positive psychology element to the fore here.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Milad.
Sarah, Elif Demiral has a question. Do you think this process of online teaching will continue after the pandemic as well? For example, some of my students commented that some of the cases, classes, I guess, were done better online, especially those that required providing feedback. Do you think we will continue with a sort of hybrid sort of teaching?
I'm sure we will. We can't go back and we can't pretend we haven't experienced what we've experienced. We can't delete this from our memories as if it never happened. We know, and I've seen, so I cannot unsee. So once you've seen it and experienced it, you can't delete it from your memory and pretend it's not. It's not like it was before. It's back to Ahmed's point. It's not as if everything's changed. And we've changed, and the learners have changed, and we know there's a different way to do stuff. So I think what will happen is that we will settle into making the best that both environments offer. And rather than at the moment, we're having to make do with an environment that doesn't meet all the needs, but it can do some things well. But what we will hopefully come to is a healthy blend of the best of both worlds. That would be the ideal scenario. I miss face-to-face. I love being in the classroom. I miss face-to-face teaching. And interestingly, I miss conferences. I miss face-to-face conferences. I miss chatting and sitting down with people and finding out about their work. But I love the fact we have this online space now that I can chat with Masood and Jalida and Ahmed. I can talk with people from all over the world, and I'm sat in my home, and it's lovely. So Elif, I think my hope is that we take the best of both environments and combine that into an effective pedagogical space. I hope.
We also do hope that.
This is about positive psychology, so we're going to stay optimistic.
Yeah. Erdem Terzi has an interesting question. He says, do you think teachers raise their expectations about learner performances in online education, especially during lockdown? If so, what kind of psychological burden does that lay on learners in addition to thousands of other issues?
Blimey, Erdem, that's an interesting question. I'm not really sure. I'm just thinking about my own experience now. In my own context, I think I became a lot more tolerant. I don't know if I should confess this in this space, but I actually think I became a lot more tolerant than because my students will tell you that I'm fair and friendly, but I'm fairly strict, and there are rules about certain things. And I became much more laid back about rules, and I learned to listen to my learners more. I learned not to make judgments, which we all do, even if we don't intend to, but to listen to them more and to trust and believe them more. It's an awful thing to say, an awful thing to confess, but I think it made me a better teacher in that it made me more tolerant, and it made me listen more to my learners and make sure that I trusted in what they were telling me. I think this is an area that needs researching a lot more, is teacher expectations of learners is massively impactful on learning. So I imagine that most of you are familiar with self-fulfilling prophecies, the Pygmalion effect and so on, that what we believe about learners, what our expectations of, and we communicate that directly and indirectly to learners. And that has a massive impact on how learners feel in our classes and feel in relation to what they're learning with us. And so for me, that's an area that is grossly underexplored. I mean, Jean-Marc can correct me, but I don't think there's very much research on teacher expectations about learner performance and abilities in the language classroom specifically. And that's something, this Pygmalion effect and self-fulfilling prophecies is an area that needs a lot more looking at. And I think people need to become aware what aspects directly and indirectly, you know, the implicit messages that we communicate in our behaviors, how that may be communicated.
Seyrediyorum da ses açık olabilir, kapatıyorum.
Okay.
Was that a question?
No, it's not a question. No.
A random comment. Okay, that's fine.
Right.
It was an interlude.
Sorry for that.
Not at all. Did that answer the question? I've lost my plot. It was about self-fulfilling prophecies and expectations. Yeah, so I think expectations, we do communicate those, and I can't speak for other teachers. I can only speak for myself in this respect. And I hope that actually it was the reverse, and that I lowered my expectations, and that I became more compassionate and became more responsive to the learners as individuals, I think.
Yeah.
Sorry, may I have my question?
Yes, please.
Okay. Shall I?
Yes, please. We are listening to
my
you.
question is that mainly we are talking about all the time about teachers burnout. So many research and investigations have been done on the nature, processes, prevention of teachers burnout. But really, I'm very afraid and sorry that rarely we have been tackling, or we have tackled the students and learners burnout. Mainly our classes are really very bombarded, crowded with so many students, but after 1 or 2 years, little by little, they are leaving the schools, leaving the classes, but we researchers have rarely tackled the reasons, sources, and solutions to the learners burnout, and how can we even prevent learners burnout, not for long term, even in our main classes, to suggest some solutions, I don't know, techniques, motivational remedies, in order to, you know, keep them and save them in our classes. Are there any really scientific solutions to address the learners burnout in EFL classes or second language classes? Thank you very much.
Thank you. That's a good question. So I think Jean-Marc is here, so he will talk about learner emotions because he's been doing work on that recently. I think there's quite a lot of work on learner emotions, probably more so than teacher emotions in our field. And I'm talking about sort of second language acquisition very specifically now. The strange thing is that in general education, there's been much more research on teacher burnout, and there's hardly any done within our field specifically. So I think there are domain differences, disciplinary differences here. I think the question is a good one, and I think it is related to teacher well-being in that the two are related. So through processes of emotional contagion, there is a strong relationship between teacher and learner well-being. If your teacher is experiencing positive emotion and positive well-being, you will communicate that and you will create an environment where you can pass that on to learners. So there is a strong sense of that as well. One of the things that gives me great hope about learner well-being is it is starting to take a much bigger place on the international research agenda. So I'm not talking about our field specifically now, where we are way behind in the field of second language acquisition. We're very far behind in terms of putting well-being on the agenda. And there's, I have a lot of ideas about why I think that has been the case, but well-being has been neglected for a long time. But I do think that's one of the positive side effects of the pandemic, is it's drawn attention to just how important that is for teachers, but also for learners. Now, one of the things that gives me great hope in response to your question is that the PISA studies, the OECD PISA studies, which are huge in Europe, well, globally, I suppose, but very important in this part of the world, they used to only measure, of course, achievement and literacy. And from 2015 onwards, they started measuring student well-being. And that, for me, is a massively important signal. Now, I wish that testing bodies like PISA didn't have a massive impact on international policy and behavior, but they do. And when a body like that starts to measure student well-being and says, it's not just about learning outcomes in terms of literacy and mathematics scores, but it's about what is learner well-being during that process and at the end of that process, then they're starting to send a very important signal about how important it is to attend to the well-being of learners while they're learning and at the end of their learning experiences. So it gives me hope that it's not just being given lip service. There is now a shift and a switch to making learner well-being an issue. And a lot of curricula across the globe now include student well-being as something that should be taught as a transversal skill. So in the core curricula, that go across all subjects, for example, student well-being or emotional regulation, social emotional competencies, those tend to be in many, many curricula worldwide now. The whole notion of well-being, for example, has come into governmental policy. If you look at New Zealand, they've got these well-being indices now that they use alongside GDP measures to say, look at the health of the country. They look at also mental health and the well-being of people. So I think it's a great question, because I think we're in our field specifically, I think we're at the beginning of that process, but the conditions globally in terms of a readiness to engage with well-being, research frameworks that exist for that, and the sort of open attitudes to say this is something that's important and we should attend to, I think that's in place in a healthy way. So I think we're in a good position for that. But I do think we need a lot more research on student well-being to protect them long term. There's very little research about student dropouts and why in our field. And there's also a need to then connect that to teacher wellbeing and how those two things are related. So it's a good topic, and there's a lot of research needs to be done still.
Yeah, really, thank you very much for your comprehensive answer. But really, from your answers, I get to the point that not only there are different sources of burnout, but rather we need to model burnout, learners burnout from different perspectives, from different curricular perspectives, teachers' characteristics, syllabus design, materials, or even learners' personal factors. Learners are eager to learn, but really they get too exhausted in the process of learning. That's okay. Thank you very much. I enjoyed it. This is Abbasian from Iran. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Sarah, it has been an hour, but there is one more question. No, can we just ask?
Yeah, I mean, people should feel free to leave. They're not trapped here with me, but I'm happy to stay.
I mean, this might be a good question to end this session. Right, okay. In fact, because this is about positive psychology and the contribution of positive psychology. This is from Orhan Kocaman. We all know that new approaches and methods emerge because the previous ones fall short in explaining some aspects. What is the most outstanding feature that positive psychology added to the field of education?
Well, lovely question. And you know, that just shows my negative mindset, because I was waiting for the reverse to say, what is it missing and what should it be doing more of? So that just goes to show where my mindset is. I think it has made a strong contribution in drawing attention to well-being fundamentally, but also looking at a whole new set of constructs that are very strongly flavored by the affective domain, but also looking at things like relationships, empathy, resilience, hardiness, optimism, hope, agency, social emotional learning. So I think it's opened the doorway to a whole range of constructs that were just not examined before. So I think positive psychology has allowed us to look at other aspects. You know, in the field of emotions, we've got away from this obsession with anxiety, which still plays a role. So don't get me wrong, it's not that, you know, positive psychology is not saying these things are now irrelevant, but it's saying, you know, that's not the only thing. If we want a comprehensive picture, there's a whole host of other things to look at. So I think a big important contribution has been to sort of create a little bit more balance in how we look at things. And I think because of the nature of some of the constructs that are looked at in positive psychology, it has drawn attention to the teacher in a way that I think it has facilitated looking at the teacher a little bit more. And I think that came because of the nature of some of the constructs that are part of positive psychology. So I think that was also part of the shift. And I'm going to answer my other one. I do think positive psychology must make sure, and this maybe links to the question earlier about learner psychology, it must make sure that it looks also at the social and at the ecology and at the setting. And that links right back to the very first question from Masood, is that positive psychology has a heritage in psychology in looking at individuals. And there is a shift in ethos at looking, instead of me, looking at we, and looking at social relationships, collective efficacy, collective agency, group dynamics. And I think that hopefully will be the next stage for positive psychology, is that we move beyond individuals, which has also been partly caused by the obsession of complex dynamic systems theory, which tends to focus on individuals, and that we now start to make that shift and we look also at collective notions and group processes and relationships.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I would like to thank one more time for your great contribution, Sarah.
Thank you, everybody, for such
and
fab
to us.
questions.
Yes. And I would like to also thank to all the participants, the audience, for being with us today. Thank you all on behalf of the COPPELT community of positive psychology for English language teachers. So thank you all for being with us. Thank you, Sarah, for being with us. And we hope to see you soon in another event, whatever it is, I don't know. But I mean, although we can't be together physically, we are still very happy to be with you online. Thank you so much.
Me too. Thank you so much. It was lovely.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you, Sarah. Thanks
a lot.
Bye.
Thank you. Thank you all. See you next time.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye-bye.
Okay, thank you.
Bye.
See you next time.
Bye, Sarah. Bye.